The 1st Division is the main formation of the Australian Army and contains the majority of the Army's regular forces. Its headquarters is in Enoggera, a suburb of Brisbane. The division was first formed in 1914 for service during World War I as a part of the Australian Imperial Force. It was initially part of the Australian and New Zealand Army Corps and served with that formation during the Gallipoli campaign, before later serving on the Western Front. After the war, the division became a part-time unit based in New South Wales, and during World War II it undertook defensive duties in Australia before being disbanded in 1945. After World War II, the division remained off the Australian Army's order of battle until the 1960s, when it was reformed in New South Wales. In 1965 it adopted a certification role, determining the operational readiness of units deploying to Vietnam. It was reformed in 1973 as a full division based in Queensland, and in the decades that followed it formed the Australian Army's main formation, including both regular and reserve personnel. Throughout this period, the division's component units undertook multiple operations, mainly focused on peacekeeping in Africa, Asia and the Middle East. Following the restructuring of the Australian Army under the Adaptive Army Initiative, the 1st Division no longer has any combat units assigned to it. Nevertheless, it is tasked with coordinating the Army's high-level training activities and maintaining the deployable Joint Force headquarters. In the event of the Australian Army undertaking a large-scale land-based operation, the division would have combat units force assigned to it and would command all deployed assets, including those of the Royal Australian Navy and the Royal Australian Air Force. History. World War I. Gallipoli. The Australian 1st Division was raised during the initial formation of the Australian Imperial Force on 15 August 1914, shortly after the outbreak of the First World War. The division consisted of around 18,000 men, organised into 3 infantry brigades, each of 4 battalions, and various supporting units including artillery, light horse, engineers and medical personnel. Each infantry battalion initially consisted of 8 companies, although in January 1915, they were reorganized into the British 4-company system. Its first commander was the senior Australian general and head of the AIF, Major General William Bridges. Over the course of 6 weeks, the division's subordinate units were raised separately in the various states before embarking overseas. The transports then concentrated off the Western Australian coast, and the combined fleet sailed for Britain. While en route, concerns about overcrowding in the training camps in the United Kingdom meant that the decision was made to land the division in Egypt, where it would complete its training before being transported to the Western Front. While in Egypt, the division was assigned to the Australian and New Zealand Army Corps along with the New Zealand and Australian Division. Following the Allied decision to force a passage through the Dardanelles, the division was allocated to take part in a landing on the Gallipoli Peninsula along with Anglo-French forces. The 1st Division made the initial landing at Anzac Cove on 25 April 1915. The 3rd Brigade formed the covering force which landed first around dawn. The 1st and 2nd Brigades followed, landing from transports, and all were ashore by 9 a.m. While the landing was lightly opposed on the beach by elements of a single Turkish battalion, the Australians were checked short of their objectives as Turkish reinforcements arrived to secure the high ground around Shamlak Beransari. Critical fights developed on the left, over the hill known as Baby 700, and on the right on 400 Plateau, but stalemate set in and little further progress would be made for the remaining 8 months of the campaign. On the 15th of May 1915, after Bridges was mortally wounded by a sniper, an English officer, Brigadier General Harold Walker, was given temporary command while a replacement was dispatched from Australia. This was Colonel James Legge, the Australian Chief of the General Staff, who was not an immediately popular choice with either his corps commander, Lieutenant General William Birdwood, or his subordinate brigade commanders. That same month, the division's artillery, 3 field artillery brigades each operating 12 18-pound pieces, which had proved inadequate in the early battle, was boosted by the arrival of several Japanese-made trench mortars. They were later joined by several heavier guns, including a 4.7-inch gun and 2 6-inch howitzers. On the 24th of June, Legge replaced Walker, who returned to command of the 1st Brigade. But after Legge was evacuated from Gallipoli, he was moved sideways to command of the newly formed Australian 2nd Division, and Walker resumed command of the 1st Division. The 1st Division's role in the August offensive was to hold the front line and conduct a diversion on 400 Plateau at Lone Pine on the 6th of August. The resulting battle was the only occasion when a significant length of the Turkish trench line was captured, but resulted in heavy casualties. The main assault was made by the 1st Brigade, which was later reinforced by the 7th and 12th Battalions. Out of an assault force of 2,900 men, 1,700 were killed or wounded. On the 7th of August, the 6th Battalion from the 2nd Brigade made an unsuccessful attempt to capture the German Officers' Trench as a preliminary operation to other assaults by light horsemen at Quinn's Post and the Neck. In October, Walker was severely wounded and replaced by the division's artillery commander, Brigadier General Talbot Hobbs, who in turn fell ill and was replaced on the 6th of November by the commander of the Australian 1st Light Horse Brigade, Brigadier General Harry Chauvel. The 1st Division was evacuated from the peninsula in December, returning to Egypt. During the early months of 1916, the AIF underwent a period of reorganization and expansion, and the division's experienced personnel were used to provide cadre staff to the newly formed 4th and 5th Divisions before being brought back up to strength in preparation for deployment to the Western Front. On the 14th of March, Walker, having recovered from his wounds, resumed command of the division, now part of 1st Anzac Corps. 7 members of the division received the Victoria Cross for their actions during the campaign. Alexander Burton, William Dunstan, Frederick Tubb, Patrick Hamilton, Leonard Kaiser, Alfred Shout, William Simmons. After reorganizing in Egypt, where it was briefly employed to defend the Suez Canal against an Ottoman attack that never came, the 1st Division was transferred to France in mid-March. Arriving in Marseille, they were moved by train to northern France, where it was initially sent to a quiet sector south of Armentières to acclimatize to the Western Front conditions. The division was not considered ready to be committed to the fighting at the start of the offensive on the Somme in early July, but as it dragged on, Anzac was sent to join the British Reserve Army of Lieutenant General Hubert Gough, who intended to use the Australian divisions to take the village of Pozières. Walker resisted Gough's efforts to throw the 1st Division into battle unprepared, insisting on careful preparation. When the 1st Division attacked shortly after midnight on the 23rd of July, it succeeded in capturing half of the village but failed to make progress in the neighboring German trench system. After enduring a heavy German bombardment, far surpassing anything yet experienced by an Australian unit, the 1st Division was withdrawn. having suffered 5,285 casualties, and was replaced by the Australian 2nd Division. The division's respite was brief, as in mid-August, with its battalions restored to about two-thirds strength, it returned to the line on Pozier Ridge, relieving the Australian 4th Division and continuing the slow progress towards Mouquet Farm. On the 22nd of August, having lost another 2,650 men, the division was once again relieved by the 2nd Division. The division rotated through the line, conducting patrols and raids until the 5th of September, when 1st Anzac Corps was withdrawn from the Somme and sent to Ypres for rest. The division anticipated spending winter quarters in Flanders, but was recalled to the Somme for the final stages of the British offensive. This time they joined the British 4th Army, holding a sector south of Pozier near the village of Flers. The battlefield had been reduced to a slough of mud, but the 1st Division was required to mount a number of attacks around Goudecourt during the Battle of La Transloy. All ended in failure, which was inevitable in the conditions. Starting on the 24th of February 1917, the 1st Division took part in the pursuit of the German forces as they retreated to the prepared fortifications in the Hindenburg Line. The division advanced against the German screen towards Bapaume, and, on the night of the 26th of February, the 3rd Brigade captured the villages of Le Bac and Ligny-de-Loy. On the morning of the 2nd of March, they withstood a German attempt to retake the villages. The 1st Division was then withdrawn to rest, joining the 4th Division. Anzac's pursuit was carried on by the 2nd and 5th Divisions. By April, the 1st Division was once again part of Gough's 5th Army. On the 9th of April, the day the British launched the Battle of Arras, the 1st Division captured the last 3 villages used by the Germans as outposts of the Hindenburg Line, thereby bringing the British line in striking distance of the main Hindenburg defences. This action cost the division 649 casualties. 4 actions during the fighting at Bourses, Captain James Newland and Sergeant John Whittle, both of the 12th Battalion, were awarded the Victoria Cross. The 1st Division was in support during the First Battle of Bullecourt, which was the 5th Army's main contribution to the Arras offensive. Once the first attempt on Bullecourt had failed, British attention concentrated on Arras, and the 5th Army's front was stretched thin, with the 1st Division having to cover more than 12,000 yards. The Germans, well aware of the vulnerable state of the British defences, launched a counterstroke on the 15th of April. The Germans attacked with 23 battalions against 4 Australian battalions. The German plan was to drive back the advanced posts, destroy supplies and guns, and then retire to the Hindenburg defences. However, despite the numerical superiority, the Germans were unable to penetrate the Australian line. The 1st Division's artillery batteries in front of Lagnicourt were overrun and the village was occupied for 2 hours, but counter-attacks from the Australian 9th and 20th Battalions drove the Germans out. In this action the Australians suffered 1,010 casualties, mainly in the 1st Division, against 2,313 German casualties. Only 5 artillery guns were damaged. On the 3rd of May the Second Battle of Bullecourt commenced. Initially the 1st Division in reserve, but it was drawn into the fighting on the second day when the 1st Brigade was detached to support the 2nd Division's attack. The Australians seized a foothold in the Hindenburg Line, which over the following days was slowly expanded. By the 6th of May, they had captured over 1,000 yards of the German trench line, and the 3rd Brigade had also been committed. The German attempts to drive the British from the gains finally ceased on the 17th of May, and the 1st Division was withdrawn for an extended rest, having suffered 2,300 141 casualties. Third Battle of Ypres. The 1st Division's artillery was in action from the start of the Third Battle of Ypres on the 31st of July 1917, but the infantry were not called upon until the second phase of the battle commenced on the 20th of September with the Battle of Menin Road, attacking across 1,000-metre front, along with 10 other divisions, including the Australian 2nd Division on the left. The 1st Division captured around 1,500 metres of ground, securing Glencorse Wood and gaining a foothold in Polygon Wood. The Australian divisions suffered 5,000 casualties from the battle. The 1st Division lost 2,754 men, mainly due to retaliatory shelling from heavy artillery after the advance had completed. The 1st Division was relieved by the Australian 5th Division before the next assault, the Battle of Polygon Wood, but in turn took up the advance for the following Battle of Broadside, the third and final of the successful bite-and-hold attacks conceived by General Herbert Plumer of the British Second Army. This battle marked the peak of British success during Third Ypres, and apart from minor roles on the southern flank of the Canadian Corps during the Battle of Poel-Capel, First Battle of Passchendaele and the Second Battle of Passchendaele, it was the end of the 1st Division's involvement. The division's casualties were 2,448 men killed or wounded. Hazebrouck. The Australians wintered in Flanders, engaging in vigorous patrolling and raiding. The 1st Division was still at Messines when the Germans launched the final offensive, starting on the Somme with Operation Michael on the 21st of March, 1918. In the first week of April, the 1st Division, along with the 2nd, began moving to the Somme when, on the 9th of April, the Germans launched Operation Georgette, an attack north and south of Armentières followed by a swift drive towards the vital rail junction of Hazebrouck. The 1st Division, having reached Amiens and about to join up with the Australian Corps, was ordered to turn around and hurry back north. Hazebrouck was reached on the 12th of April, just in time to relieve the exhausted British divisions, holding a line 5 miles east of the town. The 1st Division helped halt the German advance on the 13th of April and then repulsed a renewed offensive on the 17th of April, after which the Germans abandoned the push, concentrating instead on the high ground west of Messines. The division remained active in Flanders from May to July, engaging in a process of informal but carefully planned raiding known as peaceful penetration. The greatest success came on the 11th of July when they took 1,000 yards of front, 120 prisoners and 11 machine guns from the German 13th Reserve Division. This unrelenting pressure had a severe impact on German morale. The 1st Division returned to the Australian Corps on the 8th of August 1918, the day on which the final British offensive commenced with the Battle of Amiens. The division was sent into action the following day, relieving the 5th Division, but arrived late due to its rushed preparation. The 1st Division continued the attack for the next 3 days, driving towards Lifons, but progress was slow as the Australians moved beyond the supporting guns and tanks. On the 23rd of August, the 1st Division attacked south of the River Somme towards Thuines, with the British 32nd Division on its southern flank attacking Earlville. The Australians suffered 1,000 casualties but took 2,000 German prisoners out of a total of 8,000 captured by both the British 3rd and 4th armies on that day. The 1st also captured a German 15-in naval gun. On the 18th of September, despite being severely depleted, only 2,854 infantrymen out of Division's 12,204 nominal strength were available. The 1st Division took part in the assault on the Hindenburg outpost line during the Battle of Ypres, capturing a large section of the line. After this, the division was withdrawn from the line. They would take no further part in the fighting, having lost 677 men in the final battle. In early October, the rest of the Australian Corps, severely depleted due to heavy casualties and falling enlistments in Australia, was also withdrawn upon a request made by Prime Minister Billy Hughes to reorganise in preparation for further operations. On the 11th of November, an armistice came into effect, and as hostilities came to an end, the division's personnel were slowly repatriated back to Australia for demobilisation and discharge. This was completed by the 23rd of March 1919, when the division was disbanded. Throughout the course of the war, the division suffered lost around 15,000 men killed and 35,000 wounded, out of the 80,000 men that served in its ranks. In commemoration of its war dead, the division built a memorial, a stone obelisk memorial at Pozieres, as the division lost more casualties than any other battle. The memorial lists the division's main battles as Pozieres, Mouquet Farm, Le Barc-de-Loy, Bourses, Demicourt, Hermes, Lagnicourt, Ballecourt, 3rd Ypres, Menin Road, Broadside Ridge, Poel Capelle, 2nd Passchendaele, Hazebrouck, 2nd Somme, Lifons, Chouignols, Hindenburg Line and Epernay. Inter-war years. In 1921, after the AIF was disbanded, the part-time Citizens Forces was reorganized to adopt the numerical designations of the AIF. Thus the 1st Division was re-raised as a reserve formation, initially under the command of Colonel Charles Brand, composed primarily of infantry units based in New South Wales and Queensland. During the interwar years, the assignment of battalions to brigades and divisions varied considerably within the Army, and as a result the 1st Division's composition was changed a number of times. Its initial order of battle included 3 infantry brigades, the 1st, 7th and 8th, each of 4 infantry battalions, and various supporting elements including engineers, field ambulance, artillery, signals, transport, medical, veterinarians and service corps troops. The division was headquartered at Burwood, New South Wales. World War II. Upon the outbreak of World War II, the 1st Division consisted of 2 infantry brigades, the 1st and 8th, as well as 2 field artillery regiments, 1 medium artillery regiment and 2 engineer field companies. At this stage the division was partly mobilized, although as the provisions of the Defence Act precluded the deployment of the militia to fight outside of Australian territory, it was decided to raise an all-volunteer force for overseas service. This force was known as the 2nd Australian Imperial Force, and initially about a quarter of its soldiers were drawn from the citizens' military forces. After fighting broke out in the Pacific, however, in December 1941 members of the militia were prevented from joining the AIF and were called up for full-time service to bolster defences in Australia in an effort to counter the possibility of attacks by Japanese land forces against the Australian mainland. Later a number of militia formations took part in the fighting against the Japanese in the Pacific, notably in New Guinea and Borneo. However, the 1st Division remained in Australia throughout the war. Based in New South Wales, the division formed part of the Port Kembla covering force during the early stages of the Pacific War, and in March 1942 became part of the 2nd Corps, 1st Army. During this time the division's composition changed numerous times as many of its subordinate units were transferred. Shortly after mobilization the division lost its engineer field companies, and in June 1940 the 3 artillery regiments assigned to the division were also transferred out, to be replaced by a light horse regiment which had been converted to the machine gun role, although this too was later removed from the division's order of battle. In mid-1942, the division's headquarters staff were transferred along with the commander, Major General Cyril Claus, to Milne Force, which later took part in the Battle of Milne Bay. Later the division was transferred to the 2nd Army, as manpower restrictions in the Australian economy forced the early demobilisation of large numbers of men, the majority of which came from infantry units in Australia that were not involved in fighting overseas. The 1st Division was one of these units, and by January 1945, when the 2nd Brigade was disbanded, it consisted of only one infantry brigade, the 1st. The division was officially disbanded on 6 April 1945. Post-World War II. After World War II, the Australian military was demobilised. By 1948 this process had been completed and a period of reorganisation began. This resulted in the establishment of a regular infantry force consisting of a single brigade and 2 divisions of part-time soldiers in the citizens' military force. There was no room within this structure for the 1st Division, and as a result it remained off the Australian Army's order of battle until 1960, when its headquarters was reformed in Sydney, New South Wales, following the implementation of the pantropic divisional structure, commanding all Army units regular and CMF in New South Wales. It was also responsible for training some CMF units in other states. In 1965, the pantropic structure was abolished and the divisional headquarters was tasked with determining the readiness of units deploying to Vietnam. It fulfilled this role until Australia's commitment to the conflict ended in late 1972. In November the following year, the division was established at Enoggera Barracks in Brisbane, Queensland, and was reformed as the Australian Army's main striking force. Throughout the Cold War era, the division grew into a formation of over 13,000 personnel, which, at its peak in the early 2000s, consisted of 4 brigades, 2 regular, 1 integrated and 1 reserve, spread across Queensland, New South Wales and the Northern Territory. In 1997, the formation's headquarters assumed the additional task of raising a deployable joint force headquarters tasked with commanding Army, Royal Australian Air Force and Royal Australian Navy assets during large-scale operations. During this time, the division was not deployed as a complete formation, although its elements undertook numerous operations. These include peacekeeping operations in Namibia, Western Sahara, Cambodia, Somalia, Rwanda, East Timor, and the Solomon Islands. The division also deployed personnel to Iraq as part of Operation Catalyst and to Afghanistan as part of Operation Slipper. Present. Following the establishment of Forces Command in 2009, and the implementation of the Adaptive Army Initiative, the 1st Division no longer has any combat units assigned to it on a permanent basis. Instead, all combat forces are assigned to Forces Command, and the headquarters 1st Division provides a command and control function for high-level training activities, during which activities combat units are force assigned to the division. It is also tasked with commanding large-scale ground operations and, at the behest of Headquarters Joint Operations Command, the divisional headquarters forms the Deployable Joint Force Headquarters, responsible for commanding all deployed forces including those of the Royal Australian Navy and Royal Australian Air Force. Commanding officers